Okay, so I'm going to try and get through as much as you might want to know about carbon targets in 10 minutes. Going to start with why we want carbon targets, then have a look at how we go about picking a carbon target for a local area, which is the key concern for this webinar and event, and then think a little bit about what a carbon target should look like, what are the key features that we think based on our experience of working with authorities and setting them, what the good features are, and then as much time as possible fit in some frequently asked questions about carbon targets in general and try and address some of those. Lost the clicker.
Have you? But it was working before?
It was. Sorry.
There you go.
No, great. Thanks. So why do we want carbon targets? Well, this is the easy bit in a sense. So the world is getting warmer, and it's warmed by roughly 1 degree Celsius since the industrial period, and it takes a colossal amount of energy to warm a planet by a degree, especially one that's mostly water. And all this additional energy has an impact on the natural world. This temperature rise is essentially a good measure for a change in the system that we see, which has a number of impacts across land, sea, ice, and others, so all aspects of the Earth as a system. So this when we talk about global temperature rise, really talking about this change in the Earth system as a measure for that. And as I said, it's quite difficult to raise the temperature of a planet, particularly when the sun is in a sort of downward cycle. But you can do this by increasing the concentrations of gases in the atmosphere, which stop heat from radiating back into space in the same way a greenhouse works. And these gases at various levels can have different influences over the long-term climate. And carbon dioxide in particular is quite an interesting one in this sense. It's regarded as the primary driver of long-term climate change. And it's the concentration of this in the atmosphere we can observe has been increasing at a much faster rate. About a quarter of the increase in concentrations that we've seen over the last 300 years have been since 2000. And we can kind of see why. Humans have added around 38 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere last year. That was the most we've ever managed in a 12-month period. That's up from 25 billion tons back in 2000. So we have this human-induced issue. We have this relationship between the emissions of carbon dioxide from human activities, an increase in the atmospheric concentration of CO2, and higher global temperatures, which are a marker of environmental change. And the world's sort of main review body for climate science, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are able to produce clear recommendations based on this relationship to understand the amount of carbon dioxide that we can release over time to give us a particular outcome in the change to our environmental system. And this can be used to give us something like a global carbon budget, which is something that we can use to understand what sort of targets we need to be setting, what adjustments we need to be making to avoid a particular outcome in terms of climate change. So what does a local carbon target look like, or what are we really trying to define here? How much CO2 should we limit ourselves to, essentially, is the core question there. And this is kind of a question that sounds like it has an obvious answer, because less CO2 is always better. There isn't a safe level of climate change in a real sense. 1 degree so far has lasting impacts on weather patterns and sea level rise. However, this has to be understood as, I don't know if that's displaying weird on your screen.
It is, I'm afraid.
Sorry, it's running off a Mac, I think is the issue. But on either side of that equation, we should see acceptable climate impact on one side of the equation and economic feasibility on the other side of the equation. That's because even 30 years on, since a very clear understanding of this relationship between carbon and global warming, societies are still underpinned by processes that release large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and therefore a transformation in how fast we release those gases has an impact on how we heat buildings, how we travel, power appliances, our food system. And this requires a lot of investment to change and is potentially disruptive. And this is why we see an ongoing amount of tension between the costs of climate change, what we know to be understand as the impact, and in the long term, and these more short-term transition costs. And this is a key dynamic which shapes climate change policy and leads to a debate around how fast things should change. That said, where we are now, that process of discussion has sort of arrived at a point where we have an international standard, an international agreement on what that acceptable threshold of risk should be. And this is to say that we should stay well below 2 degrees of warming. This provides us with a consensus in which to frame that global amount of risk. And from that, we can then deduce what level of carbon, what carbon budget is appropriate in order to meet that particular level of risk. So that gives us a global understanding of where we should be. However, it's a global issue with quite a diffuse source of the problem. So it's while the impact is summed up to the global scale, it is caused at the local level. And therefore, we have to think about how we understand our particular role in this context. What is our part of the carbon target? And there are different ways of doing this. We might understand it as an equal share, simply applying the same reduction rate and the same trajectory of changing our system to everyone from the starting point that we're at now, or giving a per capita share of those emissions down for everyone to use. However, we also need to understand that we're starting from a very unequal place in many terms, in terms of the level of development that have been experienced in particular parts of the world, and also the balance between countries that produce goods that release emissions and those that primarily consume goods that are the source of those emissions. So when we think about how we determine our own particular contribution to this, our own localized target, we have to have a sense of what our fair share of that is. And we have to have some clear set of principles and some guiding underlying thinking about how we go about setting that. So our target may be something that is slightly different from that global target in that sense. So what does the target need to do? I'm just going to speed up a sec. Well, I think firstly, it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be very clear about what it's a target for, what level of CO2 is it trying to limit to, and what particular temperature outcome is it linked to. And this needs to be clearly understood by people, and to be durable and to last over time, it needs to be quite clear on how it's been arrived at, and that is an appropriate level of ambition for the challenge that we have. It should also be measurable, because we always need to understand our progress towards a target. And in that sense, we need to have things that can be use reliable underlying data that's regularly updated and is quite easily available. And it also preferably should be shared, because local authorities or any entity is usually taking on these targets for a wider constituency of organizations and local people. Therefore, it's not enough just to have the local authority involved in the process. We also need some interaction with the levels above us, like national government, but also organizations and businesses, and ourselves as voters and as consumers and constituents. So the target, primarily by being measurable and meaningful, also needs buy-in from a wider range of stakeholders. It needs to be a shared target. I think I'm only going to do one of these frequently asked questions just on time, and it's probably a classic one about carbon neutral, net zero, and zero, and the variations between those. What they might mean. There's a lot of terminology is used. Ultimately, a carbon target has to be about getting the emissions of CO2 and other sources of greenhouse gases down to near zero in the coming decades, whatever that's called. Typically, when net or neutral is used in relation to a target, it's expressing this idea of having some form of balancing on the other side of the equation. So that there's something removing carbon at the same time that we're emitting it, and that at some point there's a leveling out, a balancing of those two. And it's important to note here that there's a limited amount of balancing that can be done on the other side. There's a limited amount of removal that we currently have at our fingertips. And this has to cover things like non-CO2 gases from agriculture and emissions from aviation, and other very hard to treat sources of emissions. And it often means that for other sources of emissions, such as energy CO2, and for most stakeholders, it means that net zero is essentially zero. So the terminology can be used in different ways, but it has to have the same underlying meaning, which is having the appropriate reduction in emissions behind it. I'm going to wrap up there with a quick summary. Just skip past the point on offsets, which is just to go over those key points again very briefly. Carbon targets are there to drive the appropriate level of action that we need to get our intended outcome, that level of ambition that we've all bought into. It should be decided to be fair locally, so we should understand it in terms of what our fair contribution is. I think a good target should be meaningful, measurable, and shared. I think that's come about our work in Tyndall, and it also should focus on reducing emissions rather than looking at other things like how too much on the balancing side of things. It really has to have that laser focus on reducing our emissions that we have particular responsibility and ownership of. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so question master Sarah Mander over there. Have you managed to pull out some questions from the chat box?
I haven't seen any questions on the chat box.
Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to put into the chat box for Chris? Perhaps you might like to take this time, Chris, to tell us a bit about offsetting that you had to skip over.
So another frequently asked question that comes up is, I don't know if I can get this, how I get this view up on the slide, but broadly speaking, we get asked a lot about, are there other things we can do to meet a carbon target beyond or additional to reducing emissions? It typically comes up in the form of carbon offsets or a financial credit that can be bought to have somebody else somewhere else reduce their emissions or increase carbon removal somewhere else. The short answer is no. From our particular framing, globally all emissions need to fall to zero or very near zero in the coming decades. And that means even if you are paying for somebody else to reduce their emissions, which might be a good thing to do for other reasons, you still have your emissions at home when you get back to deal with. So that's not something that's a substitute for reducing emissions. And a similar point with tree planting has many good points. And only a minimal amount of emissions we can actually offset and balance out through increased trees. The little graph up there shows that, you know, an area like Manchester or Cheshire, less than 1% of our emissions from energy are removed through the amount of CO2 that's taken down annually through land use, and even in the Lake District, it's only 10%. So, you know, there's a lot of work to increase tree cover. However, it can only have a minimal impact in balancing our energy-related CO2 emissions. So they really have to change, and that has to be the priority.
Okay, Sarah, do you want to?
So we have, can you hear me? We have a question from David. What is the relative impact of methane and CFCs compared to CO2?
Good question. So CO2 is one of a basket of greenhouse gases that all have varying degrees of radiative forcing or effect on the climate over different timescales. So we have shorter lived gases like CFCs and methane, which are powerful but shorter lived. In the UK, I think the general rule of thumb is around 80% of greenhouse gases on the comparative assessment, which is CO2 equivalent, are CO2. And the other gases, the F gases, the methane, the N2O, those gases make up the remaining contribution. It's much harder to understand that at a localized level because of the way we measure these non-CO2 gases. But at the UK level, it's roughly that sort of 80% figure. That's different from more agricultural countries, but the UK is you know, that's roughly the case. And CO2 also has that longer-term cumulative impact that methane doesn't have, but still very important gases to bear in mind.
And so there's been another couple of questions. Well, I've got 3 more questions. Am I allowed 3?
Yes, okay, but we're going to be slightly behind, but I think that's okay.
Okay, so there's a question here about the assumptions that are made when setting a carbon budget and how those assumptions could change the size of the budget. And building on that is the idea of apportionment. So how do we, what are the different assumptions around apportionment?
Yeah, so I think the commenter sort of makes the point as well that you can use something like the Tyndall carbon budget report approach, which is available online. I think the commentator makes the point that that sets out some quite clear assumptions that are used to downscale that global budget, and we have to use some principles around fairness and equity when setting that allocation, as well as some sensible assumptions about things like cement. But they could be quantified differently, and different assumptions could be used, and that will change the size of the budget for the UK and within a local area. On the Tyndall budgets tool, you can see how things will be different at the local level, changing between a per capita share of those emissions, or an economic share of those emissions through gross value added, or through grandfathering of emissions, so looking at the recent trend in emissions to give that allocation. And you can see what the difference in the local budget is on that web tool for your local area, and see how it gets larger or smaller depending on those assumptions. So it's very important to be very transparent about the assumptions that you've used, and to understand that they do affect the size of your budget that you take on for your local area, and communicate those. Absolutely, that's a really important point.
Okay, lovely to see that people are finding their voices in the chat box. Can we move on, or have you got another question you want to put?
No, we can move on. We've got two more great questions, but I think they may be covered in some of the next speakers.
So keep a hold of those, Sarah, and we will move on to Mark Atherton from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Needs no introduction to many of you, I'm sure. So Mark, can I give you about 10 minutes to go through your slides? Are you going to be able to see them okay from there?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, great. Take it away.
Okay, evening everybody. Welcome to the new reality, even if it is virtual. So with the introduction, what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes is just give you a little bit of a potted history of what we've done in Greater Manchester with support of Tyndall and Centre and others, and almost give you an up-to-date idea of where we currently are and where we need to go next. So the first thing is that we launched our 5-year environment plan last July at the Green Summit, and since then we've been awarded A-list city rating for CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, one of only 5 cities in the UK and 100 globally. It sounds impressive, and indeed we're quite proud of it, but actually all it really means is you've got a plan, you've got some targets against that plan, and you're taking action. And whilst I would hope there's more cities that are going to join that elite group in the near future. So, going to work. Thank you. The timeline that we've worked on, basically over the last 2 years, we've adopted a co-productive approach, co-creative, worked with an eclectic steering group of people and a whole raft of experts from different parts of the economy to develop, first of all, what we called a Springboard to 2038 report. And this basically set out the science and what we needed to do. We also engaged with an awful lot of the general public to ask them what they wanted out of the environment. And in the second year, leading up to the launch of the plan, we engaged with experts to try and put some numbers on that, to try to understand what a pathway to zero carbon or carbon neutral looks like. Probably important to say that it's not a plan that sits on its own. There are plans that sit underneath it, one for each of the themes, and they're given in the orange boxes on this slide. So there's one on low carbon buildings, one on smart energy, one on transport, and one on natural capital investment. The one that's outstanding is over on the far right-hand side, which is sustainable consumption production or circular economy, and we'll produce that in the next month or two. This gives you an overview of the scope of the plan. So we cover everything from climate change mitigation right the way through to climate change adaptation and all things in between. And importantly, we try and do it through the lens of people, place and economy. So it's not just about environmental impact, it's about what's the wider socio-economic impact. Probably also want to say at this point that the 5-year plan doesn't sit alone. It sits within a basket of other plans within the Greater Manchester conurbation, everything from a transport strategy through to a Greater Manchester spatial framework. And in the spatial framework, which will become our planning documents once it's agreed, it has targets in there, for example, carbon neutral new development by 2028. And so each of the targets within the 5-year plan are hopefully replicated or have provenance in other plans as well. This is the graph I'm going to spend just a bit of time on. So this is our science-based target. Under the grey line is a compliant target with COP21. It was produced for us by the Tyndall Centre. And basically it is our fair and equitable share of Greater Manchester's emissions, global emissions. We also undertook quite a bit of modelling work. We had some funding out of Bayes to run a programme called Scatter that some of you may have heard of, which is basically a city region or an assessment tool for targets and trajectories. And that work allowed us to do a bit of pathway modelling. If you imagine the Scatter tool as being 40 levers that you can pull to 4 different extents, with the first lever being the easiest and the fourth being the most challenging. The blue line on this graph basically is all 40 of those levers being pulled to their maximum extent. So the first thing you can see is that even when we pull all of the levers under our control, we still don't get to carbon neutral by 2038 because it's the area under the curve which matters, not necessarily the date by which you achieve something. Making that even more challenging is that when we looked at some of those levers, some of the maximum positions were probably physically unachievable. So an example would be all vehicles on our roads would need to be ultra low emission vehicles by 2025. That's not new ones coming onto the market, that's all existing. And we just didn't think that was plausible. So the red line is what we're calling the Scatter GM line, and that's what we're currently working towards. It's not business as usual. So to give you an idea, in that transport space, it would be all vehicles on our roads ultra low emission by 2035, which is still challenging, but at least was in the bounds of possibility. I know the graph on the right shows that we need to, no matter which scenario we choose, really more than halve our emissions by 2032, 2027, sorry, 2023 to 2027. So we've also broken that down into where our most significant emissions are, and no surprise really, this will be true across the UK. Most of it is around heating our buildings and private vehicles. However, if we're going to move to electrification of heat, for example, or electrification of transport, or both, then we also need to produce electricity sustainably, and we need to have a decarbonised grid. So there's something there about lobbying government to move faster than they currently are, projecting it within their grids mapping. But there's also things that we can do locally by introducing more local renewables onto the grid, by increasing the energy efficiency of our buildings, whether they be domestic or commercial or public sector. Whether we improve the utilisation of resources, including energy, but not limited. So it would also be utilisation of materials, water, for example, for the embedded energy, and shift away from fossil fuels for vehicles and encouraging people to move on to public transport rather than private. None of this is new. I think what is new is the scale and the recognition that there are 2 real things that we need to do. So I'm going to shock Carly by going backwards. If I go back to this graph, what the green hashed line shows is that there's a gap between what we need to achieve and what we currently think is possible. And it's in that gap that innovation lies. So what you should come from this graph is that for Greater Manchester, we need to decarbonise as quickly as possible, but we also need to innovate because we don't have the ability to get there using existing technologies on as they stand at the moment. Just to prove that the red line that I mentioned isn't business as usual and is quite challenging, these are some of the targets and only some of them that accord to that GM Scatter red line. So half of our homes would need to have PV and a further 5.5 kilometres squared of commercial ground-mounted PV. Gas would need to account for less than 35%, it's currently at 95%, and just about every single property in Greater Manchester with 1.1 million homes will need some form of retrofitting by 2038. So that equates to, if it's just linear uptake, 61,000 properties a year. This is a huge transformation. It's not something that can be done by local authorities working alone. In fact, quite the converse. It has to be everybody within the conurbation working together towards the same sorts of goals. This is the 5-year plan on a page. I won't dwell on it too much, but the structure is that we have 5-year plan priorities across the top. So everything from sustainable consumption production through to natural environment. The 3 central columns in this are the ones that are going to decarbonise the economy and society the most. We also have key priority actions that fall down the columns. And all the arrows really show is that some of those key priority actions can be delivered together, so that you get co-benefits or simultaneous benefits. For each one of the themes within the plan, we've set it out in this way. So each theme, this one being energy as an example, has 3 priority actions: renewable energy on the grid, decarbonising heat, and increasing diversity and flexibility of the loads. That's largely about storage. Each of those has targets, and each of them has a representation on the pathway, the scatter pathway that I mentioned earlier. And as I say, it's not just for local authorities. In the plan, we've set out what we think residents need to do in the next 5 years, what businesses and other organisations need to do. We have also specified how local authorities can take a leadership position, and there are some key things that GMCA in particular can do, working with wider public sector to try and drive this transformation, reduce our carbon emissions as quickly as possible, but importantly increase innovation as well. To bring it all together, the 6 things that we are currently starting to do, principles if you like, are we need to support innovation in technology. It's not just technology though, it's innovation in finance, and it's also social innovation, so behaviour change. It's about taking new approaches. The current finance systems don't necessarily work for decarbonisation. We need to find attractive and more flexible ways of financing some of this transition. The local authorities and public sector need to lead by example, because we need to be market creators where a market currently doesn't exist, and we can't do it alone. So we need to engage with our population, we need to engage with our businesses, and we need to work between public and private sector in a completely new, different, innovative way to try and get everybody doing the same sort of thing. And if we're successful, that transformation will require us to upskill our workforce. So this is how we're doing it. This is the mission-based approach that's set out not just in our 5-year plan, but in a local industrial strategy as well. Nothing particularly startling about it. You take a big, hairy, audacious goal like carbon neutral living by 2038. We break it down into challenges. Those challenge groups each represent the themes within the 5-year plan. And then you take a cross-sectoral approach towards delivery. And that's basically what we've done. We've set out a governance framework that links our group GMCA executive right the way down to challenge groups. Each of those have developed task and finish groups. There's a broad cross-cutting communications challenge right across all portfolios. There's also an environment plan forum, which allows some of our activists and other people who aren't experts in individual challenges to have their say too. Coming towards the final slides, so what does this look like, this mission-based approach in reality? As an example, this is the Energy Innovation Group, which is actually chaired by Paul, who's going to be speaking in a minute. They've broken down to 5 different task and finish groups that you can see in the yellow circles on this slide. And each of those task groups has identified individual tasks, so we know who's going to lead on it, what they're going to do, where the funding is going to come from. And final slide, we've now started to transfer that into a Gantt chart so that we can adopt a program approach. Last thing for me to say is that some of this work is now that all GMCA and all 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester have declared a climate emergency. A lot of the work that I talked about in terms of leadership, local authority leadership, is starting to happen already. And we're doing quite a lot of work to do assessment of buildings, assessment of energy potential across the local authority estate, and we can utilise that as the framework to drive some of this market change. Thank you.
Thank you. So, questions?
While we're waiting for specific questions for Mark, there was a question left over from a couple of questions left over from the previous section. I mean, one, you've talked a lot about mitigation, but is adaptation and building resilience equally important for actions to be prioritised?
So I would say yes. The degree of the challenge is such that I think that we will need to place a greater emphasis on adaptation, because I think some measure of climate change is now going to hit us almost no matter what we do, unless somebody comes up with a miracle technology. We're already seeing impacts within Greater Manchester that are very noticeable, not just around flooding, which obviously is perhaps the largest, biggest risk for us, but also in people's well-being and health and incidence of vector-borne diseases. So I think adaptation does need to be part of it. Our approach is that we've undertaken an ecosystem service assessment. We've understand what a natural capital counts looks like, so we know what value the ecosystems are providing to the city. And now we're trying to put a Greater Manchester Environment Fund in place, which will look to try and increase investment in our natural capital particularly focusing on those areas where climate change adaptation is a key feature, or that there is another form of ecosystem service that we can enhance for the city.
Thanks, Mark. Great question here from Rachel. To what extent is climate justice reflected in the GMCA's plan?
That is a good question. I'd love to say it was, embedded right the way through. I think the reality is that we're trying to build climate justice into each of the propositions that we bring forward. And I think sometimes we might be more successful than others. So an example would be, we've just run a campaign to provide low-cost PV photovoltaic cells for residents. And it's been relatively successful. We're probably going to increase the amount of renewables on the grid by somewhere between 1 and 2 megawatts. But because we weren't able to provide low carbon grants or low carbon loans, then that particular offer was likely to be only really appropriate for people who were able to pay. And so in that particular instance, I don't think we quite got it right. However, next time we run it, and I think we will run it next time, we will look to see what other financial mechanisms we can put in place to support those people who might not be able to afford it off their own bat. So creating climate justice isn't something that you can just say and do. You need to take a case-by-case approach and understand how your actions or intended actions can be beneficial to the most people.
Thanks, Mark. So I got time for another question?
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant. I mean, you've talked a bit about behaviour change and leadership. Just on a practical level, how many staff does GMCA have, and is addressing and kind of a good place to start in terms of behaviour change, working with your own staff on climate action?
So how many people does GMCA have in total?
Yeah, working for you.
Well, bear in mind that Greater Manchester Combined Authority includes parts of the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, and also includes all of our firefighters, because it includes fire as well. So if you include all of those people, I think it's around 2,500 to 3,000. That includes our full fire service. And it's a really good question about how do we engage. So we've taken the option to try and do carbon literacy, and we're prioritising a number of staff. Fire service has been doing it quite a while actually, but the wider CA is going to be doing carbon literacy training. We're picking on senior managers and those people who can affect change the most as going first. So people who are involved in building management and procurement and energy management are going through it. Longer term, I'm not sure that we would run carbon literacy for everybody, but I think some form of internal training course which gave you a reasonable overview of what carbon impacts there were would be a good thing to do. So a general level of awareness raising across the board. And then finally, we're about to do a little bit of work looking at how our wider programs and strategies are carbon, what's the right word? Appropriate. I'm not sure that's the right word, but we're looking across the whole lot to see what the carbon impact of our programs would be.
Okay, so the questions are coming in thick and fast. Our reasoning for keeping the questions fairly short is that we worry that we will lose people in this virtual environment by the time we get to our 5th speaker. So I'm going to push on to another speaker, but if our speakers have time and we have time at the end, we can return to some of these questions and have more of a discussion. The other thing is that I asked you at the beginning, if you weren't here at the beginning, to think about 2 big questions throughout all the presentations. The first one of those is about what lessons are transferable from your context to others. What have you learned that can help others? But the other one being, what would you like to do next in terms of delivering action, and what support do you need to do that? And if you could either email answers to those to us, to Amrita, who's been in touch with you all by email, or tweet those with hashtag Tyndall20, the number 20. We'll put that into the report, and we see this as the beginning of having these conversations and trying to kind of link people up to have those conversations. So apologies if your question wasn't picked there, but that's the rationale. So I'm going to go now. I'm going to try to transfer presentation to Jonathan Ward from Nottingham City Council. So if you just bear with us a second, we'll try to do that. Okay, so take it away, 10 minutes.
Great, thanks. As ever, there's probably more than can be come to 10 minutes, so I'll try and keep it high level, an opportunity for questions, and hopefully my rural broadband doesn't drop out at some point. So I want to briefly take you through some of the work that Nottingham's been doing and our overall approach, and also to highlight a bit about the scatter tool that was mentioned by Mark just now, and its kind of current update, and how we've tried to use tools such as that and the Tyndall Centre's own work and some others within our general approach, and a little bit of things that we've learned along the way. So if this will move forward. So Nottingham's had quite a long history of working on the climate change energy agendas. For those of you who've been working this for many years, remember there was the Nottingham Climate Change Declaration, and from then on there was a great deal of work on energy in the city, and the city's managed to hang on to a number of assets and develop things around its heat network, retrofit programs, particularly for Nottingham City Homes, establishing the not-for-profit energy supply company, Robin Hood Energy, and because it's kept the ownership of things like transport, been able to have a large low-carbon transport facility, so electric buses, biogas, there's 120 of those now linked to digestion, tram network, and solar PV rollout, both across our estate and a number of domestic properties, but increasingly across a range of commercial properties. And that was driven by an energy strategy and a climate strategy that started back in 2010, which sort of brings us up to current day, and it drove targets around local low carbon energy generation in the city and trying to push for higher carbon reduction targets, which was seen as ambitious back then, but now they've been easily surpassed. The way that this work was done was really building on some very strong partnerships in the city, both in the commercial sector and particularly with our two universities, who've been a huge benefit to the city. But there's a range of partners outside of the city and also core cities, and working with people like Mark and GMCA and other academic centres and institutes like Tyndall Centre. There's also, I'm part of an energy services area that has over 40 people in it now, and that has grown through a process of insourcing and also developing commercial activities and ways of looking at how we can generate income from particularly the energy agenda, energy management to support the work that we do, about making good use of the assets we have and making those assets work together. For example, the heat network and things around the transport system. Innovation that Mark touched upon just now, very much key to that, and trying to position the city as a test bed. So we have a lot of work on the energy strong whole house retrofit model for our city homes, and that's been grant funded to scale up that approach. Vehicle to grid, fuel cells, things in newer housing, so it's not just retrofit, but looking at kind of community approaches to managing energy. Maximising value, so how do we retain the value either as a council or as a city? Developing coherent policies and strategies to drive that, particularly the action plans, and an idea that by leading on this, we can try and benefit as a council and as a city, and particularly in trying to position the city for the benefits of a cleaner economy. So bringing us up to kind of current times, we set a target of 2028 at full council last year, and at the full council year on this January, declared a climate ecological emergency. And our target is to reduce carbon dioxide from our direct and indirect energy use, so the scope 1 and 2 emissions, to net zero. So that means, well, I say carbon neutral net zero, had the explanatory note just now, but taking emissions as close to zero as possible and then looking at those residual emissions we might have to offset. That's citywide, but we are trying to influence scope 3 through policies. We just can't measure it in the same way. So it's very much part of our thinking. And as a council, we are going for scope 3 in the same time frame, and then gradually evolving to having a CO2e, so that's the wider greenhouse gas target. And it's important to note that it wasn't just a climate emergency, it was also an ecological emergency. And the importance of the 2028 number will come in a moment, but I want to talk broadly how we've brought the agenda together We had an emerging city sustainability vision through our Cities Green Partnership, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose sight of some of the wider issues that we need to be tackling. And so I mentioned quite rightly just now around the climate justice angle. And so the kind of Kate Raworth donut diagram that people may have seen combines those wider planetary boundaries around ecology and the things we need to support our lives, our societies, from a natural perspective and those own ecosystems. And in the centre, that make sure we're not losing sight of what we're trying to drive local authorities, which is how do we find that safe space where we can not only make sure we're not impacting negatively with what we're designing as a response to the climate emergency, but also trying to optimize or add value to those areas. And on the left of the screen is just a sort of top level route that we've been taking. And I'll kind of cover most of those as we go along, but just to illustrate the sort of pathway we've been taking and seeing it as an annual process of developing and reviewing what we've been doing. And at the centre of it is really around a new form of engagement, collaboration, co-creation, because we very much cannot achieve this alone. So to enact the first few steps of that pathway, we created a charter last autumn, it was adopted this January. And if you like, that set out the priorities, principles and parameters of our approach, looking back at some of the key impacts on climate change, our overall approach in that climate justice perspective, some of the historic trends, our kind of carbon footprint, understanding a bit more around that. And looking forward, and this is where we tied in with the work of Chris and others at the Tyndall Centre, and looking at amount of, or a fair share in the allocation based upon our historical emissions. So our carbon budget, we've estimated with business as usual, would run out by 2028. If we so kind of highlighting the need for reports from the UN and the climate and where we are in terms of global emissions. So for 2028, that led us to, for an ideal trajectory, 22.3% a year. That corresponds that to the typical 4 or 5% a year. And we've had a 40% reduction since 2005, and you can see that doesn't really touch where we need to go. The 12.5% line is actually because the 2028 target, designed to get that emissions shift now, actually doesn't use all of our carbon budget. So our lower bound, we must stick to the very, no, we're aiming for the other one, is 12.5% a year, and that would comply with the scientific approach for the target and the national agenda. And after we adopted that, we set out an action plan that consultation closed on yesterday. From the council perspective, 4 key areas, setting out how we need to change how we work and operate as a council: governance, decision making, financing, engagement, then carbon reduction across 5 sectors: transport, built environment, energy, waste. Those are all very, very much interdependent and shouldn't be seen in silos. Carbon offsetting, resilience and adaptation. And each area of this plan sets out, first and foremost, where we think we need to be. And then it sets out the actions we will take, we're expecting we need partners to take, and government to take in order to get there. But a lot of those actions are just the first steps. We don't pretend to have all the answers. So this is very much setting out so people can see what broadly needs to be done and where we are answering those questions along that journey. And part of this process, and we talked about Scatter just now, is a tool that was picking up from the original spreadsheet version that Mark was referring to. And what we were funded by BEIS to do is to try and broaden its reach and its usage by making it more usable, turning it online as a free-to-use resource that can help people with 2 fundamental things: understanding where their emissions are, and importantly, those wider emissions, greenhouse gases and across scopes. And then secondly, helping inform targets and trajectories for emissions reduction. And this is for all tiers of local authorities. And if you're a top tier authority in a 2-tier area, you can aggregate things. And it's very easy to sort of register and log in. It's just based upon your email address. And so the first part of it, as I said, brings together your inventory, and you can have quick summaries, and you can have more detailed assessments, and you can download this. And it's designed to help comply with international reporting standards and reporting framework. Second part, which has just been released as a beta part, is the pathways tool that Mark talked about just now. It has changed. It is slightly different to the version that was in the last scatter spreadsheet. It doesn't work backwards from a target. What it does is work forwards from those interventions and those sliders. And now it's all on one web page, where it's much easier to select those and see the changes in a graphical form, as well as being able to download the actual figures behind this, what these interventions correspond to. So it's really there to help understand the overall carbon budget approach, to set the possible trajectories and see where they are with your own trajectories, how far currently modelled interventions will take you, and to use at that outset of informing decisions, engaging people. So following from set your trajectories and your pathways and understood a bit about that, and some of those kind of key actions and programs you're developing, we were looking at if carbon reduction is a driver, how do we make sure we're addressing other sustainability themes? And then how do we get the benefits out of that? Ashton Toolkit, many of you have seen, help with identifying some of those co-benefits. And then working again with another Greater Manchester project with Bays, helping develop a tool around cost benefit analysis and approaches so that we can say, what does that really equate to in terms of value? Can that add value to large scale programs, for example, on transport with air quality and health, or retrofit in terms of jobs and health benefits? And particularly the Nottingham context, where we have the lowest level of household disposable income in the country, aware that we cannot go asking for domestic sector residents to start putting in lots of money themselves and everything. How can we understand how to blend some different finance together, using some of those benefits, understand the overall value to the public sector and to the economy, and then also identifying, so we've got a couple of approaches been developing, what are those wider impacts and what else might we want to consider at the same time as doing these programs in order to maximize the benefits around ecology, biodiversity, and adaptation. And how importantly,
wrap up, Jonathan,
yep.
please.
Yep. So final thing I'll talk about, we are very much looking at resilience and immediate need, particularly building on the old climate just tool. So thinking about how people, who's exposed and why, by their context, how we protect assets and people and services, making sure that we report and be transparent and the benefits of that and how you embed that in plans, and then engaging people in a different way, setting up new forms of ongoing deliberative channels with people, starting off by listening, building that trust, improving literacy, trying to get to the point of
Jonathan, I think we've lost your audio there, but I feel we were nearly at the end. So hopefully you can rejoin us in audio, and I can get some questions formulated.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of new questions for Jonathan, and then a couple of questions sort of following on from earlier sessions. I think there was a really interesting one about examples of behaviour change, particularly in transport, that it would be good to hear some reflections on. And then, given that Nottingham has a target of 2028, are there lessons that can be learned from that for local authorities which have more stringent targets than Manchester's?
Okay, so Jonathan, were you able to hear those questions? Perhaps not. Any reflections on transport from in this room?
Behaviour change, I guess.
Behaviour change.
Yeah.
So shall I start? I think behaviour change is one of those things that isn't new, let's be honest. We've been trying to change people's behaviour for 20 years, maybe even 30. So the question for me is around why hasn't it changed? And my answer would be that the best way to try and get people to change their behaviour is either to make something cheap, make something easy, or make something sexy. I think our challenge is that unless you do one of those things, and preferably all of them, people aren't conditioned to change their behaviour. So that's the lens that we try and look through. I try and look through, and I think there are ways that, for example, digital infrastructure and improving the way that smart cities work, that we can certainly make things easier. The rollout of smart meters is a really good example of that, where you start to get an appreciation for how much energy you're actually using in your home because you're better informed. But similarly, it helps people like Paul and the ENW to think about when people are using the energy at the peak time, or people like me to understand what the overall carbon emissions might be for a conurbation. So I can see how the smart agenda can make things easier. I think we need to make things cheaper in a way, almost by spreading out the costs, so that a lot of the transition that we need to undertake is fairly heavy upfront cost of long-term payback. So we need to think of ways that we can spread out the cost over a period. And making things sexy, I think, is starting to happen. I don't know about you, but I do think that there are more people who are considering their carbon impact. Because certainly even just a few years ago, it's risen up not the political agenda, but I think it's risen up the social agenda. And I suspect that will continue. So it's a long-winded answer to say, I think we're doing some of it, but there's still more that could be done. I'm not sure I buy the argument that people don't know what to do, but that is touted by some, which is where you need to do carbon literacy and inform people about what their emissions are. But given that we've been telling people what their main carbon emissions are for the last 20 years, I'm not sure whether the deficit in awareness where it lies.
So I'm just seeing a message here that Jonathan can hear us and can see the questions, but he can't connect his audio. So may I suggest that Jonathan engages with the chat box to answer the questions directly for people, and we move on to Simran from CDP, who's our next presenter, our penultimate presenter, and joining us remotely. So Simran, can you hear us okay, and are you ready to go?
Yes, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can. So take it away, 10 minutes. I will interrupt you when you have about 2 minutes left to go.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you everyone so much for still joining. I think it's great for people to start learning how to work remotely and online a little bit more, not only for health, but climate benefits. So it's a great opportunity. So today I'm just going to be talking about CDP, what we do, but then also some lessons learned about what other local authorities are doing and taking. For those of you that don't know what CDP is, we're a nonprofit operating a global disclosure platform, helping investors, companies, cities, states, and regions assess their environmental impact and take urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy. And we do this by providing high quality, relevant information, which we think is the fundamental basis for actually acting. And through our platform, we help to measure and understand the impact that companies and cities are really having and taking. Our data then is also used by investors, business leaders, procurement teams, national and subnational governments to help inform decision-making, policy, and some action as well. So why are cities so important? Cities actually only account for 2% of the world's landmass, but they actually account for over 70% of global CO2 emissions and about 2/3 of the world's energy. And that's why we talk about cities so much, because they're actually key in tackling the climate emergency. But while cities are actually trying to respond to climate change, they're actually also at the forefront of delivering other services. And so they actually have a unique opportunity to demonstrate how tackling climate change can also deliver many other local benefits, such as increased equity, social cohesion, economic opportunities, and increased resilience. The CDP around the world is working with over 950 cities, states, and regions. So cities in Brazil, Australia, South Africa, China, the US are all actually reporting their environmental information through our system. And we've been doing this since 2011, so it's been a long time coming. We saw a huge increase after the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and then we saw a huge increase last year as well, after the IPCC 1.5 report was released. There's never been a time when climate change has actually been at the prominent and at the forefront of so many local authorities' agenda, which makes it a really exciting time. And so what CDP really does is we work with local authorities to help them measure and monitor their progress in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we help determine if we're actually on track to meeting net zero by 2050 globally. Through reporting, we can also understand the gaps that our local authorities are reporting and what resources and support that they need, not only in the UK, but also globally. We can also better understand what climate actions are working, what's best practice, and share lessons learned. Because we now know exactly what we need to do, but we need to learn about how people are actually implementing this stuff. In addition, as mentioned before, we also showcase the leadership that local authorities are taking and the impact that they can have. So in the UK, in 2019, we had 19 local authorities disclosed through CDP's platform, from the largest cities such as London and Manchester to the smallest cities like St. David's. So cities of all sizes are taking action and actually being really transparent about what they are doing and also what they're not able to do. They're also able to disclose their targets to us, which helps us better understand how to compare them, how to benchmark them, and then actually track the progress on the commitments and declarations that they're making. So CDP also scores cities and companies that report through our platform to help provide more detailed feedback. People really understand it when you get a letter grade of what that means in terms of being transparent. So as Mark mentioned, Greater Manchester received an A score this year, which is really exciting. But most cities are not at that level yet. They're still in the early stages of gathering their information, understanding where they are, and being really transparent and open about what plans do they have in place, how many actions do they have a political commitment, are they taking action on mitigation and adaptation and water security. We think all of those three things are actually really important and are fairly evenly weighted within our platform. So this last year, we had 105 cities that actually received an A score, which was really exciting. And this isn't to name or shame anyone, but to really just highlight the ones that are really leading. The 105 cities actually represented 170 million people across 31 countries. There are cities like Mexico City, Cape Town, Los Angeles. And in the UK, we had 5, including Greater Manchester, Greater London Authority, Coventry, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and Leicester City Council. And what we found with this information, that cities that were more transparent and that had received an A-list score were actually taking 3 times more actions than other cities. So it's really important to actually be really transparent, because it means we're also seeing that they're more aware of what they're taking, what they're doing, and actually demonstrating that leadership. So just how CDP works, because sometimes it can be confusing. It is a free to use tool and system. So every year cities receive a new questionnaire. You have a couple of months to fill this out. Then we share all this data and information with our partners, such as the Global Covenant of Mayors. And then we work with our partners and other organizations to help improve cities' responses by improving their data quality or their climate ambition or their climate action plans, depending on their needs, to help improve the quality year on year. And it's an annual cycle to help track all of this and to see where our city is globally at. And so in the UK, what we could actually see is that it's been really exciting that over 250 local authorities have actually declared a climate emergency. But in terms of measuring and monitoring that progress, only 19 disclosed last year. Out of those 19 local authorities, only 9 actually had a carbon neutral or zero carbon target. Out of all of those cities, only 2 cities actually had a climate action plan aligned with what the latest science is saying. That was Greater London and Greater Manchester. So it's really important that actually it's great to make these declarations and be making these commitments, but actually the data behind it needs to actually back it up. Just seen a question, can any local authority join CDP, or is it just cities? Any local authority can join. It's relevant to anyone. Cities is just the most commonly used phrase globally. But yes, any local authority can participate. And through all of this data collection that we've done, we really realized that cities are really struggling in figuring out what actions that they should be taking. So with Ashton and Friends of the Earth and CDP, we developed this 31 climate actions toolkit for local councils to really figure out what should you be taking and who else has actually done that already. So there is a full methodology behind it, which Ashton led on to determine, what is the cost savings or the co-benefits for each type of action, and they developed a hypothetical Ashton town to help kind of extrapolate that information. So you can also download an Excel file, which actually just helps you kind of dig deeper into the data if that's of interest to you. But on a wider scale, what we did is we combined actions into 8 categories, such as raising money, buildings, transport, council estates, power generation, waste, land use, and influencing others. So things include like raising car park levies, electrifying your buses, improving retrofitting. We've provided examples of local authorities across the country that have actually done stuff in these areas. So for example, in terms of procurement, many local authorities only actually...
Okay.
Sorry?
2 minutes left, if that's okay.
Yep, that's no problem.
Thanks.
So for example, most local authorities only actually directly control about 2 to 6% of their direct emissions within their boundary. So influencing others in the area and stakeholders is actually really important and really crucial. So your supply chain and your procurement policies can have a huge impact. So some examples are Manchester's sustainable procurement policy, where they're really trying to embed in their contractors and suppliers to be aware of the council's commitments. Durham County Council is also trying to purchase more energy efficient electrical appliances and equipment as well. So you can find their policies in the platform. Some things that can have the most impact in terms of reducing emissions are also identifying renewable energy in your local plan and investing in this renewable energy development. It also just provides you with that level of information of the cost savings to better understand what has the most impact. So for example, the Mayor of London launched the London Power with Octopus Energy to offer citizens 100% renewable electricity. Another project that's happening in Warrington Borough Council with York and Hull is that they're investing in green electricity to provide it to 18,000 homes, which will also provide the council with an additional 100% green electricity. And then what the toolkit also really does is to show the co-benefits of these types of actions as well, so that you're not only choosing the actions that maybe are the most impactful in reducing carbon savings, but also co-benefits, which can be really helpful in making the case of why you should be taking certain actions. So for example, Norwich City Council developed 100 ultra-low energy homes for their council estates, which actually met the Passive House standards, which is above the national government recommendation of EPCC rating. And just to close up, hopefully I've met the time, is that, disclosure is really important to actually be transparent and to track our progress, to really measure and monitor the success we're having, but then also to identify the gaps that we need. While we're setting really targets, we actually need to see a lot more implementation, and hopefully this guide can really help the local authorities kind of drill down and prioritize and make the business case for why they should be taking certain actions. And just to say that our platform will be open in April, so if you're interested, feel free to get in touch with any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Simran. For answering questions, are you able to share a webcam with us so people can see you answer?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great. So any questions for Simran? There were a few sort of comments and things earlier, but has anyone got a particular question for Simran? You were so effective, Simran, that you were able to take questions in the chat box whilst you were presenting, which I thought was very impressive.
And,
thank you.
Some of the earlier questions about co-benefits, which I had in my back pocket to ask, and which have just been answered.
Okay, Derek, okay, so there's a question. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, so it's about kind of the network that CDP has. So CDP, we also work with 8,000 companies and 500 investors around the world as well. I think what we're really seeing is that level of collaboration that's needed to actually implement these types of actions. As I said, local councils don't have much power over what they're doing. So we're actually really trying to promote and create city business collaborations and climate alliances. So I can share a playbook that we've also created to help with that, to see how local councils can be working with companies within their areas to actually help them reduce emissions and leverage their experience as well. And I think that type of network and that kind of exchange is really important, because local councils can't do it on their own, but companies are also really trying to work on this agenda and are also really struggling to just do it on their own. So they're looking for that support and that convening power that councils can actually really play, which I think is really powerful and important.
Thanks. Okay, so we have, if there aren't any more questions, we have one more presenter, Paul, who has been patiently waiting to be the final presenter. What I'm going to try to do is take Paul's presentation, then take some questions just for you, and then use the rest of our time to kind of take questions to the whole panel. Oh, thank goodness, we've moved the camera away from me. We'll definitely be wrapped up by 8 o'clock. I'll see how quickly the numbers start to drop off as we approach that time, but we'll take sort of 10 minutes or so now for Paul to present. Then we'll take some questions from him, and then we'll have this sort of open session where hopefully Jonathan will be able to answer some questions there as well. So unlike Simran, I'm not able to multitask and set the slides up whilst also saying that. So let's try and... Okay, so Paul's from Electricity Northwest, who are obviously entirely central to making the transition for the electricity system, and they've announced some ambitious targets for their own operations in line with the city and the combined authorities' ambition, but also seeing their role very much as facilitating the decarbonisation of the electricity system, as well as, I think, the expansion of that system to do kind of different things. So we'll hear a little bit more about those sorts of things now. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Karen. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to join you all tonight. Hopefully this presentation will build on some of the things that Mark talked about earlier, and how we're working with GMCA to help them implement the vision, and also some of the things we've just heard from Sirian about what people can do as well. So try and go through both of those quite quickly. Our plan and approach is based on a detailed understanding and some very complex forecasting of what we think is going to happen. We produce every year a distribution future electricity scenarios document. Our 2018 document broke down the Northwest, which is the region that we serve, with about 5 million people in it, 2.5 million premises, into a number of sub-regions, and gave detailed forecasts of what was going to happen in each of those regions on our electricity network out, so that people could see what was going on. It shows how energy consumption is going to change, how new embedded distributed energy resources such as PV and wind power will come onto the network, and new uses of electricity such as electric vehicles and heat pumps will come on. In 2019, to supplement the previous report, we also produced a carbon compliance scenario, which demonstrated what would happen out to 2050 if we're going to hit the targets. And what we're working on at the moment for the 2020 report is a scenario that includes the achievement of GMCA's targets for the entire Greater Manchester region, which is about half of all of the demand in the northwest of England that we serve, achieving net zero by 2038. So that will be coming out in the next iteration of this plan. But this information is really useful to us in terms of all of our planning of our activities, and many stakeholders tell us it's very important to them as well. So this year we've also produced an interactive workbook that allows stakeholders to interrogate a lot of the data in here. So that basically sort of sets out what the DFAS is. There's more data in the slides here, but I'll whiz over it quickly in the interest of time. Some of the headlines about hitting these targets set out there, about the number of vehicles that need to decarbonise if we're going to reach our targets, building decarbonisation and the amount of additional generation coming onto our network. But what this does show us is that our network is going to be a lot busier as we go forward. Peak demand is going to increase by at least half by 2050, and there's going to be double the amount of energy being generated more locally and put onto our network rather than the traditional way of generation being done in very large power stations and coming onto the national grid and then flowing down to our network. So we're seeing almost a complete reversing of how electricity networks in the UK work. So what this tells us, though, if I can move on quickly, about the network in the northwest of England and Greater Manchester in particular, which is our sort of case study, is that actually we have quite a lot of capacity to enable the low carbon transition. So we're in quite a fortunate position. We've been working hard to be good custodians of the capacity on our network, anticipating these kind of challenging challenges, and we do, for example, have plenty of capacity to connect electric vehicles. So one of the things that we've said to Greater Manchester is don't let fears about the electricity network act as a brake on taking action to encourage the adoption of EVs. The graph here shows forecasts for the loading on our substations, the horizontal line at 100%. Once you go past that, you start to overload the substations, and what you can see is that the majority of our substations have some headroom. That's the sort of red line currently, and then we put on scenarios for how those load up as you go forward. And you can see that it's only a small number of the large substations that are going to need to be reinforced and strengthened as we get to the sort of 2038 kind of scenarios that we've been looking at. So that means that we've got plenty of time to probably accommodate the first 500,000 electric vehicles, and we believe that that can be easily achieved. Then how can we work with local authorities to and other stakeholders to achieve some of this transition? Electricity North West has committed to supporting Greater Manchester in its decarbonisation targets. We've adopted 2038 as a target for us to decarbonise all of our own activities, and we're making very good progress in doing so. But we also want to facilitate and lead some of the way in enabling this transition for all of the users of our network. So with the local authorities, we are working on helping them develop their plans. Some of the information we published was a sort of building block to the environment plan that Mark talked about earlier, and we're actively engaged in many of the working groups and supporting a lot of the activity that's going on there. With large businesses, we are trying to be an exemplar ourselves. We have set up a programme to create 2 net zero depots in the northwest of England. One is our training academy in Blackburn, which we are aiming to have achieve a net zero status in the next couple of months. And what we'll then be doing is publishing all the information about how we achieve that. We've probably overdone it on the technologies so that we can demonstrate to everybody that which technologies were the best, which were the most effective, which have the most positive business cases. And we are now funding a targeted engagement process and putting more resources into getting some of these messages out there. And I'll come on to some work that we've done on top 5 things to decarbonise in just a second. And with SMEs and domestic customers, again, we're trying to do a lot more promotion and information sharing to help people understand what they can do. Now, if I come back to the businesses, what many of our business customers have told us is that they are not sure what to do first. So working with Tyndall Centre, we've done studies on a number of exemplar archetypes of businesses and come up with the definitive, if you like, list of what are the first 4 or 5 things you should do if you want to move your business forward to decarbonisation. So here's a first example for manufacturing and warehousing, and this is very common across many of these archetypes. First thing you should do is fit LED lighting and motion sensors to reduce your lighting electricity consumption. That has a very positive payback period. Usually within 2 years, those kind of investments in LEDs will pay back. And then the information goes on to talk about improving space heating, fitting solar panels, and electrifying on-site transport. Another example here quickly for office space, fitting solar panels again is a great example, and LED lighting, which comes up time and time again as one of the most beneficial technologies for businesses to adopt. And I think it's very true for domestic customers as well. So you can see that there's lots of information available that we can make tangible for businesses in our region, and we hope that by really engaging with businesses who are, represent about 2/3 of the load in Manchester, that we can get a big transition to towards the low carbon targets and get some real momentum and movement behind them. Okay.
You win the prize for being the only person 3 seconds under time, so excellent. So some questions from the last presentation from Paul. Do you have some of those?
I mean, during the last presentation, we've had, quite a useful discussion actually about where people in local authorities, how people can share best practice to avoid reinventing the wheel. That often, sometimes in local authorities, you might be restricted by the IT platforms that you're able to use. So I don't know, well, we get some more specific questions for Paul, if there's any reflections on that kind of, that forum for sharing best practice.
So there exists a Huddle group.
I think it was Huddle that some people have problems accessing.
Well, if you can't access Huddle, then you're struggling because most of the things won't work with somebody. Huddle's the one that most people seem to be able to get hold of in local government because it's approved by the technical wizards within Whitehall who say it's compliant with British standards. So most local authorities should be able to get Huddle, and if they can't, it's probably because their IT department block it, and they need to have a discussion with their IT department and say that, and point out all the reasons why Huddle is perfectly acceptable.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Had a question come in about LED lights and that some people struggle with LED lighting, and whether you have any reflections on that.
Well, yes, in fact, we've been introducing LED lights across all of our offices and depots in Electricity North West. We found that some of the earlier generation of LED lights, the light colour actually is a little bit different, and some people found that gave them a headache or something like that. But actually, the latest versions have got that's been developed quite a lot further. So there's a slightly warmer version of the colour of the light now, and those problems seem to be going away as the technology develops. So we don't really We're not really experiencing any problems with that or having any complaints from our staff. Don't know if Carly, you've had any other experiences of that.
I haven't. If anyone, we've got a lot of people on the line, if you like. So it's interesting to hear that idea, but it's developing and perhaps that problem being addressed. But it's not something I know about.
Oh, now here's a great question that's just come in. How about ENW letting Greater Manchester Combined Authority have a real stake in the distribution network, so that it can shape strategic priorities, investment decisions, and benefit financially to support its own zero carbon programs?
Well, the GMCA does have a real stake in the business in terms of shaping our strategic priorities. Mark and colleagues work with us very closely. We have a chief executive panel where our chief executive meets with a range of local stakeholders to set our strategic agenda. We also have 2 other panels of local stakeholders who help us focus on supporting customers with vulnerabilities and focusing on sustainability. And those panels are incredibly influential in channeling the strategic direction of the business and the activities we undertake. So as you can see, our alignment in our strategic vision for decarbonisation at 2038 to be completely in line and taking the lead from GMCA is an example of doing that, and that is driving a massive amount of investment across the business. Could GMCA take a bigger stake in the business? Well, the business was recently put up for sale, so offers were open for all sorts of different investors. Unfortunately, GMCA apparently was not successful in that process, if they ever entered into it, or had the resources, and others have done. But interesting development that one of our new shareholders is actually a major electricity company in Japan, who do have good links with the city already, and are helping us with technology exchange so that we can learn from some of the great technologies that they've developed over in Japan that will help us on this journey, and also we are transferring some of our technologies to them as well, to help them with decarbonisation, because there are some things we've developed here in the UK as well.
So there was a question there specifically for Paul, I think, and then we could open it up to wider questions. The one around struggling to install PV in a different area. Can we ask that one?
Yeah, and there's another one to Paul that's come through as well. So yeah.
I can't see those.
Yeah. It's like the optician's test. Are you doing that, Sarah? Or
so is that Lancaster City Council can't add the solar farm it's planned to the grid due to lack of capacity? Well, that's an interesting one. I'd love to know more about that. There generally isn't a lack of capacity around Lancaster, but there may be some costs about specific locations to get that connection on there. So that's definitely something, if I can get more detail about that, I'll have a look into.
And then the one above was a more general question, maybe about networks elsewhere, from Rachel.
Yeah.
Investing ahead of need.
Well, I'm not yet. Yeah, I know that there have been much tougher challenges in the southeast and the southwest of the country, where there was very rapid growth in solar farms, quite large solar PV farms, when there was a lot of still more subsidy around supporting those, and those are the areas where a combination of, particularly southwest, combination of cheap land and good sunshine meant people went for that very, very quickly. So they saw very rapid growth, and that has limited the capacity. Now that it's effectively the capacity for export is used up. There is some investment being put into the network from National Grid, which will free up the ability to export more generation onto the grid in the southwest. But that has a number of other things to achieve to get that off the ground. But that's coming in the next couple of years. There are more technologies that can be developed to get more out of the existing network. One thing that we've done in the northwest is to develop different ways of connection offerings, and some of those are being adopted now in the southwest and southeast. The next thing for distributors like ourselves to do is to start to manage our networks in a more active manner, but that takes quite a major investment in control technologies. We're making that investment in the northwest, and we'll go live with that system this year. Other networks are probably a few years further off in being able to do that. I would expect that to be in the early sort of middle of the decade that all networks get to that kind of level of technology. But there's more that can be done, and also we are now all engaging with our regulator to talk about our future business plans and how we might make more investment quicker in the network. We've seen in just the last few weeks a major statement from Ofgem about their decarbonisation action plan, which is very supportive for more investment in networks to ensure that we take away these blocks to connecting renewable generation in particular, and to preparing for big increases in electricity demand. So the prospects for that are very promising.
Great, thank you so much. So we have around 20 minutes before I will definitely call things to a halt. So if there are any questions that you'd like to ask of all the speakers, or any points you'd like to make, please tap them away into the chat box. And I'll also invite Jonathan from Nottingham, if he's able to access audio now, if there's any of the questions he'd particularly like to address that we didn't manage to get to because his audio dropped out. So Jonathan, the floor is yours if you would like it for a few moments.
Thank you. I had to switch to my home computer and be tethered to a router. So hopefully it works now. On the issue of LEDs, actually, there's some emerging research around the impacts of, particularly at a few species at night, of LEDs and streetlights and other areas upon ecology. And there's differential impacts across species, and also potential impacts where it's a brighter source of light and there's encroachment to people's houses, etc., around circadian rhythm, so our body clocks, etc. So there are, on the whole, they're generally very positive, but there are some potential impacts upon ecology that might need to be factored in around the siting, and also the types of bulbs and their projection, just to help deal with that. On the issue around, can people hear me okay? I just saw a...
So we can hear you. If a few other people could tell us if they can't hear you, that would be useful.
I just saw one message saying they can't hear me. So
yeah, any sort of yes, we can hear comments in the chat box would be great.
Okay, I'll carry on then. I think there's a huge challenge, and we're grappling with at the moment, where we're looking at things, say, around the future of heat, and at the same time, and we're very much looking spatially across the city, but at the same time having to look at the alignment with our transport strategy around, particularly around electric vehicles and charging points, and then around the broader generation agenda and energy systems management. And we've had decades of systems which have been very much from a source of generation out, managed largely centrally, to a system that's going to have to be managed more locally, and in a more timely fashion, and with more behaviour changes involved. And there's an issue around what scales for different systems we govern that process, and who's involved in that, and how we integrate the challenges around transport and heating and broader energy availability all at the same time. And a lot will need to be achieved around when we use energy, how we store energy, and the integration of heat assets, electrical storage, and energy in transport. And so there is obviously going to be a period of finding our feet around what form of governance works and with which type of public authority, whether you have the LEP level energy strategies, you have unitary authorities like ourselves, cities where there's an obvious scale. And so I think that it's a real learning curve that a lot of us are going through at the moment, but clearly we have to try and approach this in a different way. And we also have issues and grid constraints for new developments going in, just in terms of purely the house building and other targets. So then if you're adding in those other complexities, it does bring everyone around the table to discuss a different way. So I think there's an opportunity there to reflect across different local authorities about how people are approaching that and what the expectations are of different partners. And I know through the Energy Data Task Force work that obviously that part of this agenda is also our sharing of data, having data in the right form to help us inform those decisions.
Sorry, I'd muted myself there. Thank you very much, Jonathan. So are there other questions that we could put to...
If I could just comment on
sure.
one I just saw pop up there about car parks.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not an expert in car parks at all, but we have been engaging a number of car park operators who are looking at new connections onto the network or enhanced connections to enable electric vehicle charging in their car parks. And one of the conundrums I know that many car parks have wrestled with is how do you install and manage the infrastructure for charging if payment charging, if people want to do electrical charging in the car parks. And one of the best concepts I've come across is where people have actually said, well, what we're going to do is going to completely avoid that cost altogether. What we are going to do is to increase our charge for using the car park, and then when you park there, you can charge for free.
Okay.
So that actually acts as a big incentive for electric vehicle users to use that car park because they can charge there. But actually, the charging costs for electric vehicles don't tend to be prohibitively expensive for doing that, and it seems like a good business proposition for some of these car park operators. So whether that's a bit of helpful information, I don't know. But
so, and I think maybe the question to Jonathan and to Mark, maybe more, is the question is also getting at whether we should be encouraging people out of their vehicles. Any reflections on the sort of relationship between car parks policy for local authorities and their sort of carbon ambitions? And I suppose wider ambitions. So if we don't take it all down to carbon, but instead think more about what kinds of cities we want to create. Are they cities with fewer personal vehicles in them? Or, is that not a priority given that as long as we kind of switch them to low carbon means?
So shall I start?
If you like, yeah.
I think actually we probably need to stop thinking about car versus non-car and start thinking about appropriate modes of travel. And what I mean by that is that there will be some people for some journeys where utilising a personal vehicle, they don't really have another opportunity at the moment. That might change. We might look at mobility as a service and different ways to operate. But right now, they'll need to use a vehicle. And for those people, ideally, moving towards vehicles that are less carbon emitting is the right thing to do. This is like Greater Manchester, and I suspect many of the cities in the UK, it's not really just about carbon or even about air quality, although those two things are really important. It's also about congestion. And so getting people to use more public transport is important because we need to transport people from one place to another in a most efficient manner, and hopefully do it in a way which is comfortable for them, which is hopefully cheap, clean, efficient. And it so happens that it's probably lower carbon as well. And then obviously you've got the active travel people who you've got the ability to be able to cycle or walk, then that should be one of the options that you use. So for me, it's about a transport plan that promotes the utilisation of a variety of different transport methods. Obviously, my view would be that we should prioritise those which are lower carbon. But we need to reflect, and this comes back to your point about climate justice earlier, I'm making an assumption that those people who have the most polluting vehicles are probably those people who can't afford to change them either. So there's a climate justice argument there about how do we support people to make the right choices in a way that they can afford.
Jonathan, do you want to say anything to that one in particular?
Yeah, in agreement with Mark around, we have to look at why people are travelling, what are the outcomes that people need, and how do you protect those outcomes, and particularly for more vulnerable people. And with our action plan, we very much sort of set out a hierarchy, rather like your reduce, reuse, etc., which was trying to reduce the need to travel non-essentially within city boundaries, and then the active travel, and then the public transport offer, and basically trying to make it being a better offer to travel in that way, and mobility as a service that Mark touched upon there, and particularly integration of our different transport routes with active travel, so that it's more preferable. And actually, most of the car traffic is people coming into Nottingham. Nottingham itself has very low levels of car ownership and very high levels of public transport usage. So that it's one of the issues actually about working with our neighbouring authorities about that kind of commuting traffic. And on the issue particularly of car parks, well, we obviously have the workplace parking levy, which has helped fund the tram extension. So that's for helping reduce the number of car parking spaces in businesses and trying to avoid that sort of charge at citizens. But we have made a sort of commitment to fully do a full review of the impacts of road user charging and what an emissions-based parking tariff policy would be like, both internally and publicly, occupancy-based parking signposting, and so on. So it is all part of that consideration. And then if you're not using parking spaces with particular usage over time, what else are you using those assets for? Another consideration. But going back to Mark's point, having to think around who is needing to use that and for what purpose. And if you're taking something away, are you still allowing that function to happen for those people? So very much that focus.
I mean, just one thing to reflect there from our own institution, the University of Manchester. For many years, we have been, I suppose, quite critical based on our research of the university's policy of providing quite heavily subsidised parking. And it was kind of an area that was very unquestionable. And actually, in the last few weeks, we've seen a change in that with a doubling of car parking for professor level and a sort of sliding scale so that the people paid the least in the university are maybe not paying any increase at all. And I think, to get that innovation gap closed, sometimes it's about doing new things, but sometimes it's about stopping subsidising the wrong thing. And we are still, I would say, as an institution, subsidising it because it's under market rates, the parking, but it's a step in the right direction, which seems really, really unlikely even a few years ago. So hopefully that's something that we'll see more people doing too. More questions from you, Sarah?
I was going to say, well, there's a specific question, Paul, which is that many of the technologies you highlighted in your presentation have been around for a while. So why does he think that companies aren't implementing them? And then I think maybe while answering that, that innovation gap is something that's been a kind of a recurrent theme throughout the questions. So it might be interesting to hear people's reflection on, how that innovation gap can be filled.
Yeah. Okay. So why do we think companies are not adopting those technologies? Well, what our customers have told us is a couple of things. One, they don't have the time and the priority to do the research to work out what it is that they should do. So, and two, they're not sure who to trust and where to get the information from. So the feedback to us when we did surveys of our customers about business customers about what we could do to help was, well, we trust you, so could you give us the answers as to what steps we should take first, which are the best thing to do, etc., and where are the most likely paybacks to be. And that's why in the recommendations we've made, all the technologies are fairly tried and tested, because that enables us to demonstrate that there is a strong technology choice there. There is a competitive market providing these kind of technologies, and there is a valid business case and one that people can properly understand in doing that. So those are the reasons for them being tried and tested technologies. But the reason we sought to intervene was because what we were told was people didn't know which ones to choose first, where to go first, who to trust, etc. So we're trying to set it out in as simpler form as possible. And what we will do, working very much with GMC and with Mark, coming back to his comment about making things as sexy as possible, is to try and create some of that pressure, if you like, for people to do something. And I think we can see that in many forms, politically, socially, that employees are calling on business to say, what are you doing as my responsible employer to move forward on this? And we need to channel all of those kind of voices to insist that businesses do something, and then provide them with a ready answer as to, okay, so what first?
Cool. And then we've got the innovation gap question.
So I did say it's not just technology and innovation, it's financial and social as well. But if we just look at technology for the moment, one of the stats I threw up was that in addition to having half the houses in Greater Manchester coated in PV, we also need 5.5 square kilometres of ground mounted or commercial. But just put that into context, the amount of derelict, underused, neglected land in Greater Manchester is about 16 square kilometres. So that's quite an ask. However, if you start thinking about some of the technologies that are starting to emerge, where you have PV embedded within window panes, there's lots of glass office buildings going up in Greater Manchester. Okay, the cost of that technology is still quite high and the efficiency is quite low. You can see how, if you were to be able to develop new forms of PV, which are much more easily deployed and can be built within the fabric of existing infrastructure, then some of those targets become, let's say, easy, but certainly easier than they currently appear. So what's stopping it? We funded a piece of work a few years ago, actually, which looked at how you get innovation from the desktop, from the research desk, if you like, through to commercialization. And what we found was that it took in excess of 5 years, minimum 5 years, and sometimes 10. Now, we don't have, as we've already explained, we don't have 10 years to wait. So what we need to try and do is shortcut that mechanism to accelerate the amount of deployment and increase the amount of innovation which goes from desk to pilot, demonstration, and then commercialization. We need to make that happen far quicker. Obviously, I'd love it if all of those ideas were based in Greater Manchester, as I'm sure Jonathan would in Nottingham. The truth is, though, that we really need to put better time and effort into looking to see where the best ideas are internationally. Because when you start digging in, there are some really good examples of innovations that are happening globally that aren't yet being taken up. So what I would like to try and do is develop a mechanism to see some of the best ideas globally and trial them here.
Good.
I could add a little bit from sort of Nottingham side there. There's both on the external sort of citywide challenges and partly with our own operations. We're part of the Innovation Gateway, and that's one sort of grouping, also part of a pilot project with Innovate UK domestic mission, which is really framing challenges for small businesses to put new ideas forward and help develop those around how well we frame those challenges and articulate that problem, so that there's an opportunity to bring those ideas to market in a supported way, and very much thinking around some of the near to market ideas that we know are out there, and they're not necessarily all in the UK, and that's partly why the Innovation Gateway project has been quite helpful. And then also with all our innovation work, for example, with the energy sprung technique and the whole house retrofit, having an idea of what happens to exit the sort of innovation phase and the scaling phase. It might be multiple levels of scaling to work out different issues or different forms of trial, but trying to have that plan around at what point does this then become something that can be rolled out further, and how to do that without dependency on grant funding, because that's one of the issues in the past, that many areas of the country have had wonderful innovation projects that are just isolated examples. They haven't really gone further, and we have to move away from that, which is where the business model side comes in. So using funding judiciously, and obviously a transitional period where a lot of us have had Horizon and other European funding, the new funding streams and new collaborations that are going to be needed to make sure we continue that work. On the social innovation, just very quickly, yes, that's really important, taking people with us. There's some really interesting work from Nesta and also from Energy Systems Catapult, looking around ideas of collective intelligence, how we involve people in some of these challenges. Effectively, how do you bring the end users into the process? There's the Living Labs models, and in Amsterdam, the Advanced Metropolitan Studies Institute has a really, really nice sort of schematic of how you can bring together business, citizens, academics, and governance to take some of these problems in a city and work through them and bring that innovation together. And we've been very much trying to engage citizens, not just as a one-off for our consultation, but inviting them to kind of an ongoing sort of sandbox environment to try and get their expertise in and to work their expertise up with those other actors at the same time. Internally, we're developing an e-learning package, which kind of is a little bit like the carbon literacy approaches, but to try and make sure that we can not only change the behaviour of staff internally, but get some of their ideas and developing that route to highlight the best ideas coming through and how they are solving particular problems.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Simran, can I just bring you in before we wrap up? Any reflections on kind of bringing people along or that innovation gap? And the other thing I'm going to ask people to do whilst you're reflecting on that for us is, although my nervousness about the technology has meant that I've asked you all not to share your video all evening, I would really like it if you would share your video now, and I'm going to try and take a little picture of all of your faces so that we can include that in our report to give a sense of everyone's different background and where you were joining from. So Simran, if you could reflect on that for us, and if everyone could turn on their webcam if they're happy to be captured, that would be great.
Great, now we can see who's in pajamas and who's not. But no, I think it's been really fascinating, really interesting. I think for the innovation gap, what I think is a bit untouched as well, or what we haven't mentioned a bit today, is how we can leverage companies who are really trying to tackle this issue. So in London, we've created the London Business Climate Leaders Project to get 11 companies who've committed science-based targets as well to support the city in helping them meet their zero carbon target. So they've created working groups around energy, buildings, transport and waste to see what the companies can actually do in terms of R&D within their boundary. Because they're also struggling and actually trying to operationalize the work that they're trying to do. So how can you actually bring them along too and just leverage their teams, their supply chains, their investment, which they actually have so much more that they can do than local authorities. So how can you actually just bring them along and have them actually invest for you instead?
Thank you, Simran. Okay, I'm going to give you all notice now that now is the time to smile because the capture is happening. So 1, 2, 3, smile. And you've been captured. Thank you all so much for your contributions. I do apologise that we weren't able to get together. I think there could have been so many great conversations between the people in the room, rather than it being a bit more kind of chalk and talk, as we would call it, of us speaking here and you having to mainly listen. So I apologise about that. We'll try to address any outstanding questions in the report from the event. But for now, thank you all very much. Take care and good night.